Nice to see you guys today for this live talk that is devoted, since the title, to a problem that has been considered with very great interest by some authors during the last years, not with reference to the case we are going to address today, but with the reference of many examples of civilization of humans on the planet. In particular, Jared Diamond and Joseph Tainter have written very important pages about the fact that societies seem or do not seem to understand when they are facing a fatal challenge for their future. And I try to apply this perspective to an historical case that I'd like to present you today. The historical case is the case of Emperor Augustus. And I wanted to analyze this case with an ecological perspective, in particular the perspective of human ecology. The emperor embodies this society. Through his acts, we sometimes see the action of a society to try to ensure the best conditions to survival. The environmental challenge consists of conditions within the social group and the relationship with other social groups in the given territory. These are classical aspects of human ecology. Indeed, when we consider human ecology, we not only deal with the problems related to environment, but we pay particular attention to the problems related between a population and the populations that live around it in the territories that are close to those of the population we're interested in. Augustus' choices bear the coloring due to his inclination and the economy of his time, not unlike the choices made in late antiquity by emperors who legislate on subject of desert lands. Some of the situations in which imperial legislation develops have, in our opinion, the ability to reveal a risk for the survival of the society to which this legislation were addressed. To say it very shortly, I think that Augustus understood that there was a fatal challenge in front of the Roman society he was the leader of. Augustus became emperor in 27 before Christ and would have lasted as emperor until Anno Domini 14. That means he has been the longest living Roman emperor of the entire history of Rome as an empire, a history that lasts for more than 400 years. When he became emperor, this is an open question among historians, and it's still discussed if he became emperor in 30 before Christ, 27 before Christ, 23 before Christ, and why there are these uncertainties. Because the role of Augustus as a leader had not immediately a formal recognition. Okay? So Augustus, during the first years of his activity as the most important person in Rome, to quote a famous documentary that is popular in these days about Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls, so The Last Dance, he was the MVP, the most valuable politician in Rome, a lot of years before becoming the emperor. And during these early times of his service for the city, he showed to be a very clever politician interested in analyzing the problems in deep and collecting information like no one before. Indeed, to analyze the problem I want to submit to you today, there could be a nice collaboration between different fields of research. But unfortunately, legal historians and historians of demography, legal historians and historians of agriculture, legal historians and historians at all do not have very proficient dialogues during the last century at least. Indeed, the specializations of our disciplines have led to lose opportunities. And I quoted in this Ferrero Radizza, that is one prominent Roman historian, writing in a famous in a famous collection of books devoted to the growth and the decadence of Rome in the late 70s of the 20th century, where Bonfante, Gattausen, Ferrero, and yours, that are historians and legal historians grouped in these names, managed in varying degree to grasp the relationship between history and law without making one the creation of the other. More recent work tend to segregate history from law, making each other to understand. And that's exactly the problem I wanted to premise. It's the problem for analyzing this perspective in Roman times. So, what is Augustus to us in this talk? Augustus is a keystone which requires a broad look to interpret its actions. And now let's get into the challenge I I want to address my analysis, and I devoted the book I told you about. Augustus rises to power in a time between 30 and 23 before Christ, and sees the intrinsic and very risky weakness of Rome. What is the weakness of Rome? I know if you have even a very basic memory of Roman history, it's very likely that you remember that with Augustus, the civil wars end. Augustus defeats Antonius in the Battle of Actius. Cleopatra dies with Antonius, and Augustus is the only leader that remains alive and working in Rome. Therefore, the Senate and the whole population address him like the new strong man in the town. So, what can be the weakness of that city in that moment if the war is over? Well, I've matured this opinion by a few lines of a great French historian whose name was Claude Nicolet, and that recently passed away. Les Romains de la fin de la République et surtout du début de l'Empire ont eu une conscience de plus en plus claire des limites étroites et d'une certaine manière de la fragilité de leur domination impériale. According to Nicolet, the Romans understood, were perceiving in some way the fact that their power on the regions around the Mediterranean Sea was a strong power, but with a weak basis. And this kind of lack of certainty about the possibility to let this power on the rest of the Mediterranean basin last appears in many aspects of life and culture of the Romans at the time of Augustus. And indeed, Nicolet writes, à plusieurs reprises, ils avaient pu constater qu'elles risquaient d'excéder les capacités de leurs forces et de leurs ressources. So, governing the empire was easy to say, less easy to do. And in particular, governing and maintaining the empire took a lot of efforts and a lot of resources. And the Romans knew they were not so well equipped. And some Romans knew it better than other Romans. I put here a quotation by Cicero, Leges, that is one of the texts which Cicero likes to express what a good politician should be doing. Okay, and I put in bold font the crucial part of this est senatori necessarium nosse rem publicam. Senators, that means the top level politicians, according to Cicero, that was by far a supporter of the senatorial party. Senators must know everything about the republic, about the state. Videtis iam genus hoc omne scientiae diligentiae memoriae sine quo paratus esse senator nullo pacto potest. And I think that a senator must know everything he can with the best cure for accumulating this knowledge and the best memory to keep in mind everything he knows. Because without these virtues, he is not prepared and cannot produce any good progress for the state. He is called to a guide. And who is the guy Cicero speaks for? In particular, of course, I'm not suggesting that Cicero writes these lines for Augustus, but who is the author that embeds these qualities? Well, for what we know, thanks to the biographies we inherited from Tacitus and from Suetonius, we know a lot about Augustus. Well, it's exactly Augustus that knows, records, and analyzes information. He is meticulous in applying the Ciceronian teaching. And there is an episode in early years as a government in Rome that shows it very well. 23 before Christ, Augustus go visiting with his colleague. He was a consul that year. You know, the consuls are the two supreme magistrates in Rome. So at the time of Republic, nobody was above the consuls. And he went visited the eastern part of the empire. The Romans called it empire even before it was an empire. It was still a republic. Empire has to do with the fact that the Imperium Rome applies to these territories. And by visiting these countries, as often happens during modern times, and sometimes even in ancient times, I would say more likely in ancient times, Augustus got ill. And the uncertainty about his life was great. And so, with the great fear for his life, he left his Breviarium Civitatis to his colleague. What is the Breviarium Civitatis? The Breviarium Civitatis that comes back again at the time after the death of Augustus was kind of a fundamental document in which all the figures and all the basic information about the empire were collected. The supreme politician of the city and the supreme politician of the empire always had it in his hand, because with this information he could deal with the problems, he could decide appropriately, he could really apply what Cicero taught the politicians to do in order to be good politicians. When he is just really in danger for his life, then he gives his Breviarium Civitatis to the colleague that eventually, because Augustus did not die, will have given that breviarium back to Augustus, and he could use it for the rest of the years. But this episode suggests very well what importance Augustus attributed to the perfect knowledge of what of the empire. And what was the big challenge of Rome? When Nicolais says that the Romans had very great doubts about their forces and their resources, he refers to probably what Augustus knew very well. Because Augustus is the only emperor from which we know he had 3 censuses made. You know what a census is, no? A calculation of the total amount of the population. Today we have censuses going on constantly because we have technological means that allow it to be done very easily. But at the time of the Romans, to levy a census was a very, very complex thing to do. It took magistrates, it took a lot of work, and it took very great efforts in order to make all the sums correctly. For many reasons, since the way the Romans used to calculate, the means they had available for doing it, and for the sharing of the information. Imagine to count the people in the inner Turkey and then to evaluate them in the calculation of the total population of Rome. Well, Augustus had many censuses, more than 3 done, but 3 of them were only about Roman citizens. And why did he count Roman citizens? My opinion is that he wanted to know how many Romans he could count on at the beginning of his power in the city. Indeed, the very first survey was done in 28 before Christ, then a second one in 8 before Christ, and the last one in the last year of his empire in 1409. What changes between these three times? Well, the figures we know from these censuses are figures that the emperor directly, so it is not a second-hand information, but it's a first-hand information, has given to us in his memories that are carved into the marble at the Arapacis in Rome. The censuses mark the whole empire, and they show well that the population of Romans grew very, 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 very slowly. 0.2% between the first two censuses, when it became 0.8%, that is slow, but at the same time is 4 times the previous increasing ratio between the second survey, the second census, and the third one. Actually, for the historians, there are a lot of problems to conciliate the fact that the Romans were only 900,000 in 69 before Christ, the last census of Republican time, and then become 4 million during at the time of the first census led by Augustus. There are many hypotheses about that. They are not so significant for us today. The demographic hiatus is not so important and brings the historians to give two explanations that diverge quite significantly about the amount of Romans that were living in Italy at the time, because the assumption is that most of the Romans were living in the peninsula and just a few part of them were living abroad. Well, what is more interesting for me today is that, in my opinion, Augustus, taking in consideration the first figures, could immediately understand that the Romans were a few people in order to control the vast empire they had created. Because even with 4,000 million people in year 28 before Christ, we have to calculate that men adapt for the army are more or less 1/3 of that amount, and therefore we're talking about a bit more than 1 million people. That would not be a great army in modern times with modern technology. It was really a small amount of people for the army of that time. And most important, in my opinion, Augustus thought that to let people know what were exactly the figures of the Romans could have been dramatically dangerous for the city. And actually, I told you before that we know these figures from the memories of the emperor itself. But he released these figures, he let these figures to be known by everybody just the year he died, through the representation of these figures on the monuments that have been created all around the empire to recall his reign and to recall the successes of his reign. So Augustus probably knew that the difference between the Romans able for the army in 69 before Christ, 900,000 people, and the Romans able for the army in 28 before Christ was pretty the same figure, if not even a little less. But now the enemies within the borders of the Roman Empire were defeated. The only enemies remained outside the borders. And in my opinion, his main concern was exactly that the information about the weakness of the Roman forces could reach the areas outside the borders of the empire and invite mighty populations outside the Roman borders to enter the Roman borders and to attack the empire. And so what he did, as a politician that knew, analyzed, and then decided, in my opinion, he took action. And he took action. Oh, I'm sorry, this slide is not perfectly seen. And the pity is that it's not perfectly seen in its last part. That is the most important one. But I will summarize it. Well, he took action in order to increase the number of the Romans, in order to do whatever he could to solve the demographic problem, the fatal challenge that the empire was facing. And he did it in two ways, in my opinion. I spoiler a bit the conclusions. He did it at the beginning of his efforts by using the personal example and the moral suasion to invite the Romans to take care of the demographic problem. But during the last years of his empire, during the last 10 years of his empire, in my opinion, he shifted to a more direct and effective way to force the Roman reconsider the need of being married and bearing children for the sake of the state. Well, this is like to suppose that Augustus was animated by a social engineering project aimed at demography. And actually that Augustus has been a social engineer is not an original idea that I have developed. Dieter Neuer, 30 years ago, a prominent Romanist from Germany, actually 40 years ago, suggested that Augustus was a social engineer, but his idea was linked to the very common idea among the legal historians that Augustus was a very conservative person interested in restoring the old customs, something like an old-fashioned guy that is really in love with customs that have already disappeared at the time he was living in. Indeed, the thesis proposed by Neuer is still reconciled with the classic one of an Augustus who is extremely concerned about preserving and restoring customs. And here I quoted a famous phrase by Roald Syme that has written the most important, probably, book about Roman society at the time of Augustus in the 20th century, the Roman Revolution. The loyal citizen might gaze upon Augustus in the shape of the young revolutionary leader, resolute and almost fierce in expression, or the priest with veiled head, aged, austere, and remote. However, it seems to us well not to rule out that Augustus identified a first-order practical problem, the demographic crisis, that is the challenge under the ecological point of view, and tried to deal with it with traditional tools, cloaked in morale. But then he threw the mask in front of the poor results of the own actions. Indeed, if you have attended some classes of Latin, maybe that you have met Propertius as one of the poets living at the time of Augustus. And Propertius wrote many of his poems to a woman called Cinzia. He could not marry because of the social differences and the classes they belonged to. But what became a reason for being desperate between the two lovers is the project of law to obligate Romans to get married that appears in 27 before Christ. And that first design of a law in order to force people to get married, and say in a mediate way, push Romans to bear children and therefore to increase the number of the Romans, the two lovers would have been forced to marry someone, and their desperation would have increased because of this obligation to marry. Well, actually, it's my opinion that Augustus started with traditional tools and then arrived to more innovative ones. And my personal idea is that thinking of Augustus as a conservative, an old-fashioned politician is really a great mistake. Augustus was able to profit of any kind of narrative, of every kind of communication language. It has already been written that his idea of Pax Romana has been important in his propaganda, not less than his military actions and his political actions, because he has always paid a lot of attention to let everyone feel the Romans as mighty and therefore excluding they could start a rebellion or they could start a fight against the Romans. So he has always paid a lot of attention to the way informations were spread. In the beginning of his governmental activity, he started with traditional tools by pushing with moral suasion people to consider the opportunity of increasing the number of Romans. Then he found that his first measures between 27 and 18 before Christ did not produce any effect. And the second census he had in 8 before Christ is a very important census because it revealed that in 20 years, from 28 to 8 before Christ, the Romans did not grow. 0.2% is less than Italy today. It's actually an increase of the population that is not a proper increase of the population. It's an amount of new-born Romans that cannot substitute the old generations and cannot actually guarantee the new tasks the Romans had on their head. And therefore, I agree with a great Roman law historian in Italy whose name was Vincenzo Aranjo Ruiz. He released a law in 4 Anno Domini, who takes the name of the magistrates that presented it, like any Roman law, la lex Aelia Sentia. That is the first law no more promoting the marriage, but directly promoting the fertility and connecting bad consequences, negative consequences, to the fact that people did not marry. What does it mean, bad consequences? It means that likely the Lex Aelia Sentia was the very first law introducing the fact that if you were not married and you could inherit money and land and houses from someone that died and created you as his heir or was your parent, you could not inherit as you would have been entitled to do, because the Lex Aelia Sentia provided the limitation of what you could inherit. In particular, a limited capacity of inheriting if you were married but without sons. Therefore, if you were a so-called orbus, married without sons, or and in the other case, the worst one, if you were not married, therefore, if you resisted the pushing activity of the prince to marry, if you was celibis, then you could lose completely the possibility to inherit. So a very, very severe way. A very severe way to push people take in serious, that serious consideration, the need for increasing the population of Rome. But at the same time, Augustus never revealed publicly his fear was for the safety of the borders and was for the sake of the empire. Actually, he always acted putting the mask of the moral duty in front of these measures to push people to marriage and to bearing children. And just in the end of his life, as I already told you, he decided to reveal the figures of the Romans, and he did it in a way that was totally different to the past. Because, and this is the interpretation of the figures of the three censuses that I share, because they wrote it in advance, and I find their explanation still very convincing. The prominent scholars Belloc and Brunt, he decided not only to put in account the men able to serve in the army, but he decided to add also the women, the youngsters, the children, and the elders that were no more able to serve in the army. In this way, he could release final figures that were large, that appeared to be important to those subjects all around the empire that could think of 4 million Romans ruling the empire. Remember that at the time of Augustus, probably were living around the Mediterranean basin, roundly 30 million free people and a large amount of slaves, because that economy was based on slavery. But unfortunately, we don't know about the slaves, the amount of their number. But 4 million Romans were better than 900,000 Romans, even if there is a bit of a trick into this figure. Alongside this way of communicating the figures, he strengthened his way of working in order to let all the population understand what was the need at the time and what was the danger that they had in front of them. In my opinion, indeed, the activity of Augustus to push the Romans consider actively the demographic problem is an incremental trend that is very interesting and shows a common trait to other ways to deal with challenges. For instance, in the very early phase of the COVID pandemic, I think you remember, no? Very early, the measure where we advise you to wash your hands more than 2 times a day and to avoid very crowded places, okay? Advices, not obligations, no mandatory tools or devices to protect you, no prohibitions, just a friendly advice. Of course, coming from the government, therefore something you should be paying attention, but not yet an obligation. When the situation gets serious, then we had in March this year an incremental trend of the measures, and we got first the prohibitions, then the mandatory use of devices. And this is what did Augustus, in my opinion, in order to cope with the fatal challenge of the times he was ruling the Roman Empire. First, he gave incentives. First, he gave opportunities of a faster career to the Romans that decided to get married and eventually to bear children. Then, in the last part of his life, because in my opinion he saw these original incentives did not work, he decided to use also the strong man. He decided to use also sanctions, like the one I have mentioned. At the first, we see a favor for marriage. In the second part of his life, we see a favor for fertility. In the first time of his government, we see rewarding measures. In the second part, the system of the caduca. Caduca are those goods that you are entitled to inherit, because you are the son of the dead ones, or your name is in the last will of the dead one, but you are not married. For the fact you are not married and have no children, that you are married but have no children, you cannot inherit. Therefore, first, a model based on a renewed way of registering family states, then a whole legislation based on the most hateful and moreover economically profitable information. Because the system of the sanctions was working thanks to the collaboration of the citizens that could even anonymously communicate that someone was not married or was not bearing children in order to have him excluded from the heritage, and the person that informed the state about this condition could be granted a percentage of the inheritance, therefore creating a climate, creating a social earthquake in the city. And that's the strongest point on the side of the sanction. But I would like to end by referring to what is, in my opinion, the most relevant action that Augustus took, that is really inspiring, because it shows very well that in time of a crisis, people can really decide to change society in a stronger way. I have told you that most of the historians, even today, consider Augustus someone not really innovative, really conservative, very fond of all old-fashioned values. Well, in the last legislation, the Lex Papia Popea, about fertility and marriage, he put a special advantage for women with more than 3 children if citizens, and more than 4 if citizens but born slaves. You know that in Rome, when a slave was freed, he became a citizen. But the condition of being previously a slave made of person a different person to a native citizen. So, in the last legislation about fertility and marriage, Augustus puts an incredible advantage for these women, because he determined legally that these women had the right to manage their fortune. They could not only be owner of goods and money and land, because this was already possible, but up to that moment in Rome, every woman, in order to manage her own fortune, needed a man alongside her. Well, from this moment on, from 9 Anno Domini, with the Lex Papia Popea, this is no more. Women with 3 or 4 children have the right to administer their fortune, to manage the goods that are part of their fortune. This is a unique change in the female condition in Rome, and it's an extraordinary change in their condition. Also because it was coupled with the abolition of a limit to inherit from the husband that previously was affecting the richest part of the population. In practice, previously, the richer women in the city, the women that were wives of the richer men in the cities could not inherit from the husband. Since this moment on, they could also inherit from their husband. And thanks to the right, depending on their children, they have also the right to manage this fortune without the need of a tutorship from another man. This is the last measure that Augustus took, in my opinion, in order to cope with the unique problem of the demographic decline of the Romans at his time. And he probably took it at the end of his life because the signs of the military weakness of the Romans had already started to be evident after 8 and 9 Anno Domini, when the Romans were defeated in what is currently Slovenia and what is currently Germany, about the city of Teutoburg. Therefore, Augustus really felt the danger for the city and decided for the most extreme measures. What is interesting to me, and I wanted to share with you, is the impression that sometimes even the human examples of civilization show the capacity of understanding the risk that is in front of them, even if in the case of the Roman Empire, this was easier, because what is easy to be understood by a community sometimes appear more clear in front of the eyes of a unique king or emperor or leader of the community. This was, in my opinion, the case of Augustus, and wanted to share with you these few words in order to present you this research. Hope it did not sound too nerdy, and that if you have, and of course, if you have some questions or if you want to share some impressions, I would be absolutely pleased to answer and to talk with you about this. Thank you very much for your attention. I do thank you, Pietro. Khalid.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening, Khalid.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor, for your time, especially straight after a 3-hour lecture. But thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I just had a comment, maybe there is something that the politicians of today can learn from Augustus, because although he didn't have the same kind or speed of communication, he still managed to find a way to analyze information, and he took action based on this analysis to solve, for example, the demographic problem. I don't know, why today's politicians, why do they always try to avoid taking responsibility? Is it because of incompetence, or is there something deeper than that? Because I'm just thinking about the current crisis. They're always trying to avoid responsibility, and also the use of language they use to try to explain the current crisis. Just have this comment.
I think that your question is that your comment is absolutely on the spot, and the reason is that Augustus knew the condition of the country he was called to lead. I don't know if you know about Roman history in detail, but to summarize very briefly, Augustus was not meant to be the leader of the Romans. He was a weak young guy. He was nephew to Julius Caesar, but he always remained in the shadow behind Julius Caesar until Julius Caesar lived in March 43. He appeared later when the real strongman after Julius Caesar, Marcus Antonius, went in a crash to the Senate. And this weak guy that had never created a military history behind him to be appreciated, so he had not the allure of Marcus Antonius, started showing that he was the nerd of Roman politics, able to learn and to practice at the end of the day better than any. The great teaching part of the life of Augustus, in my opinion, that is what you are suggesting with your comment, is that a great politician is a guy that learns constantly, that prepares his activity by learning and analyzing constantly the facts and the information, but then deciding to act. What we see in modern times are two actions that are exactly the contrary of what I'm telling you. Because on one side, politicians that are selected in ways that not always award particular quality, politicians tend to consider the fact of being elected as the result, when that is the beginning of their activity. The beginning, not the goal, not the end. But they spend all their efforts and sometimes all their fortunes in order to get elected. And then once they are elected, well, let me know when is the next election. I prepare for it, you know, and that's contrary to what is shown by the example of Augustus. Second, we have politicians that avoid to take decisions, and the reason is connected to the first one. When Augustus could take decisions because he was a strong man, and therefore nobody could skip his authority, and he was not actually in danger of being substituted or being discarded by the Roman Senate, for instance, that was the only organ of the Roman Republic still lively, Augustus could decide what action to take and could change this action when he did not find it effective and worked with a perspective of generations. Modern politicians don't like to take decisions because then there is an election, and when there is a new election, if you have decided something that is not popular, then you may be not elected again. And for the fact that to be elected is the result of a politician in modern times, unfortunately, this is something that doesn't pass. It's hard to conciliate the fact of being elected and the fact of being adopting decisions for generations. This is what Augustus shows very well. It's possible to be done, but he was not elected. He won the civil war. He defeated Marcus Antonius. He became the only strong man in Rome. Nobody could interfere with his power. Luckily for the Romans, he was moderate and paternalistic. But of course, he was not democratic, and some of the Romans in the elite of the Romans knew it very, very well. Therefore, alongside people like Virgilius or Titus that wrote in order to salute and in order to promote the power of Augustus, we have people like Tacitus, or people like the lawyer Labeo that refused to collaborate with the empire. Tacitus lived a lot later. Tacitus didn't meet Augustus, but he has a feeling with the figure of Augustus that shows very well that an elite of the Romans in the first century after Christ were still dreaming of a restoration of the Republic and were not convinced that to have started an imperial history was the perfect solution for the government of Rome. Nice that you asked that. I think that you are right in suggesting that taking responsibilities and getting more and more prepared for leading the countries are the two things that Augustus can teach to government people even today. Lane.
Thank you for the explanation. Thank you.
I do thank you, Khalid. Please, Lane, speak.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thanks a lot.
Hi.
It's very interesting. I was wondering, in this particular case, how many primary documents are historians working with these censuses? And are there more primary documents with this case than, let's say, with other cases for ancient Roman history? And also, what kind of language expertise do you have to be looking at these kind of documents?
Well, thank you for asking. In the case of the censuses, we are pretty lucky because we have what we can call primary documents, because the censuses have been reported on the Arapaches of Augustus, and despite the fact that the Roman Arapaches, so the altar of the peace in Rome, have been destroyed, and what you see today are fragments in a monument that has been recreated in modern times. This monument that have been built in different cities of the empire was preserved in the city of Ankara, current capital city of Turkey. There, in the temple of Augustus, a history of the life of Augustus, the res gestem divi Augusti, that means the fundamental facts of the divine Augustus, was carved into marble just after the death of him, and it has been written by him. All the witnesses of the time confirm that Augustus wrote his own autobiography to be carved into the marble, and at the moment of dying, just a few before dying, he gave this text to the Vestal priests, that were the women, the virgin women, priestess to Vesta, a Roman goddess, and they provided for the publication of this autobiography that contains the figures of the three censuses I was mentioning before. So quite a primary source, confirmed also by another epigraphy, because recently we found an epigraphy in Ostia, you know, the harbor of Rome, that has been carved a few years after the 9 Anno Domini. We know it because the magistrates are mentioned, and we know the series of the magistrates. Therefore, when the name of a magistrate is used, we can date the epigraphies, and in that epigraphic document we find figures of the census that are compatible with those referred by Augustus. So those figures come from a primary source, substantially confirmed. That is very unique. The rest of the informations we know from the historical times. I have already mentioned Tacitus. The other fundamental for these researches are Cassius Dio, that was a senator living 200 years after Augustus, that could access documents of the time of Augustus according to modern historians, but therefore these informations are second-hand, would say third-hand information. Or Suetonius. Suetonius lived less than 100 years after Augustus, and his information were more accurate and more close in time to his life. Therefore, his biography of Augustus is based on second-hand information, but is considered to be a very good amount of information. Then, what I have referred to the text of the laws, so the Papian Poppaea and the Eliacentia, are laws that have been reconstructed by modern historians thanks to different kind of sources. The Eliacentia, we know something from a papyr that is currently preserved in Michigan, United States, and was found in Egypt, where a soldier went to have his family registered according to the Eliacentia law, and the law is recorded in that papyrus with the informations that are crucial for us. Other ones are mentioned into the works of Roman jurists or in other historical books written at the times of Romans. So there is a variety of sources. What is taken to analyze them is a good knowledge of Latin, but in general they are not so difficult to be understood. If you remember something when you have attended classes of Latin, you know that Suetonius or Cassius Dio writes in Greek, but Suetonius is not exactly the most difficult author to be translated. Tacitus is a bit more difficult. So it depends a bit on the source. The epigraphic I've shown you in advance, taken from the Res Gestae Divi Augustus, is official language, and therefore pretty clear, very synthetic, like everything in the Roman writings, but not so complicated. Thank you for your question about the sources. I did not said anything before. Magaila, please. Please speak.
Ciao, Prof. Thank you for presentation. It was really good, but very much to take because there's a lot of terminology that goes on. It's quite hard to follow. But I was just doing, I'm thinking about a follow-up question from what Khalid was asking.
Yeah.
And wondering if there are, for example, an international organization that may be like quite responsible to help small governmental organizations to take responsibilities in some cases, and like also maybe what like people in their local communities can do to try to because most of the time when we think about government organizations, they take long to respond to what we on the ground consider simple decisions to make. And I was wondering what people can do in such cases.
It's a nice question. When you mentioned the international organization, I was thinking that actually international worldwide organization, like for instance the United Nations, could be the only one that played the role of Augustus, because they have the opportunity to get informed, to analyze, and to know information for all around the world. Therefore, they have the background that Augustus had. What lacks the United Nations is the power to decide that history granted to Augustus. And that's the major difference, in my opinion. International organizations actually are so well informed that if you mind what has been released during the last months after the COVID pandemic, we know today that a provision for a pandemic linked to flu was estimated to happen in a few years, and in a report that have been released last year and the year before, 2019 and 2018. It was, accordingly to these reports, a matter of when, but not a matter of if. Of course, if it is very hard to be prepared for something that you don't know when it will come, but it is hard for me to think that if the international level would not have been in competition with the national government, maybe we would have been more prepared for the pandemic. We would have been better defended against the pandemic, because if those with the information would have been able to decide, they probably could have been deciding. National politicians had all the problems I have already referring before, answering Khalid, in deciding about that, because they tend not to think to long-term politics. They tend to think to short-term politics only, and that's probably the weak part. I think the communities can do what they can in order to strengthen international order. The more I get old, the less I trust national governments, the less I trust national organization. I'm anti-cyclical. In this time in which everybody wants to see back the power to the small country it belongs to, I'm absolutely convinced that only at international level we can find the conditions and the guarantee to be free and protected in a way that is better than what our tiny countries and tiny governments can do. Thank you very much for asking, Magaila. Dominic. You have parole. Speak. Please. Dominic. Dominic Van Assendong. Can you speak? Can't you? No other questions. No, it was working. I could listen to the noise around you. I'm sorry that you could not.
I think maybe now it is working.
It works perfectly now. Can hear you.
There you go. Yes, so I wanted to follow up shortly on the short-term and long-term politics you were talking about.
Yeah.
Because in this sense, the Roman Empire faced a long-term problem, and he also made some decisions to propose a long-term solution. And do you think that in his case, lack of democracy, so him not having to worry about being re-elected, aided in making right decisions because short-term solutions were not an option?
Yes, Dominic, of course it helped, because if you have someone that is clever and able and well informed and has the power to decide by himself, lucky condition. Unfortunately, this is one of the main reasons that moved Charles McIlwain writing Democracy, Constitutionalism, Ancient and Modern in 1939, when many in Britain were fascinated by the figure of Adolf Hitler in Germany and were thinking that Britain too needed to get rid of the parliamentary life and start having a strong man able to decide fast and to promote the progress of Britain as it has been for Italy and for Germany in the recent years. Thanks, they thought, to the strong leadership of Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Well, it's the best challenge for democracies in every time, not just modern times, but even in ancient times, to combine the sharing of the power, because we perfectly know that when someone is entitled the absolute power, it tends to vices that always come out: corruption, diminution of the freedom of the citizens, no respect for the individual freedom, no respect for the basic human rights. And therefore, it's the biggest challenge for democracy, doing everything in order to get able to answer fast, but with a long-term perspective, even if answering fast with a long-term perspective is not exactly the most effective way to get votes during the new polls. So you definitely put some salt on the scar tissue of modern democracies, and you underline something that is absolutely true. But in order not to leave you and leave us without any hope, I underline the fact that since the ancient time up to some of the best historians in the 20th century, this situation, this regret about the weakness and the slowness of democracy in deciding with a long-term perspective is well known, and is exactly the challenge that makes us saying with Winston Churchill that democracy is not the best system to govern our countries, but is actually the best we've found now. So, therefore, the only way we can behave is to strive to let democracy go through their problems and go through their limits that are embedded limits, like in this case. Thank you very much for your question. Okay, guys, if there are no other questions, I confirm it was a huge pleasure to be with you today. I leave parole to Antonella Campanini.
Oh no, io volevo solo ringraziarti, interessantissimo, e rifletteremo sul fatto che se Augusto è riuscito a trovare dei sistemi quantomeno per limitare la debolezza che aveva rilevato, anche le debolezze della democrazia che rileviamo ora potranno trovare in un futuro quantomeno un'ipotesi di soluzione. Comunque, stiamo meglio così, direi.
Thank you so much.
Interessantissimo.
Grazie, grazie.
Grazie, thank you, grazie a tutti.
Have a nice evening. Have a nice evening. Bye.